November 24, 1944. From a concrete observation post on the eastern approaches to Tokyo Bay, a low, wind-swept ridge near the village of Higata, Colonel Hiroshi Tanaka stood with his binoculars pressed to his face and felt the cold bite of the night air crawl through his tunic. The city below was a lattice of dim orange, factory flames and the pool lights of docks, but tonight the tug of distance and the weight of expectation made each light seem fragile, like a match struck in a storm. Tanaka's breath fogged. His sergeant Nobuo Sato, a veteran of earlier air alarms, kept one hand on the telephone switchboard, fingers stained with oil and cigarette ash. They had been briefed on the Allied bomber threat for months. Leaflets, maps, and whispered intelligence all spoke of superfortresses, of a new American bomber rumored to fly faster, higher, and with more guns than anything Japan had seen. But rumors are shadows until the moment they take a body in the sky, until sound becomes shape. At 22:14, the shape arrived. It arrived first as a thin, steady hum that the ear registered before the eye. Tanaka lowered the binoculars and listened. Not the ragged staccato of a fighter or the laboring beat of a twin-engine bomber, but a high, continuous noise like a diesel trawler at long distance. Sato pointed toward the northern horizon where a faint silver streak drew across the stars. Under the glass, the streak did not sputter like Junkers or the familiar silhouette of a B-17. It held a length and regularity that made Tanaka's stomach clench. Behind it, a pale contrail unspooled, long unbroken at an altitude that put it above the searchlight's reach. The men on the ridge exchanged a look that required no words. B-29, Sato whispered, as if naming it could make the danger less real. He knew the catalogued English name from translations, from those blueprints smuggled back to the Air Defense Bureau. Colonel Tanaka did not speak. He watched the superfortress cleave the upper air, a distant silver cigar with swept wings and 4 engines that sang an alien chord. Against the scattered stars it seemed to glide on a different order of physics, too high, too steady. Even the moonlight seemed to hesitate when it moved. In the command tent below, Lieutenant Commander Keiichi Mori hunched over a map table, the light of a paraffin lantern painting his uniform a sickly yellow. He tracked the B-29's projected line on the map, marking positions with a stub of pencil. Around him were reports, radar blips from the coastal station at Chiba, a terse telegram from the Met Office about wind layers at altitude, and the names of the interceptor units he could draw upon. Mitsubishi Type 1 fighters, the Nakajima Ki-44s, were ready on stripped runways, but their climb rates and service ceilings meant they would be chasing a ghost. The radio crackled with orders from higher. Engage if possible. Protect Tokyo. But the words had the brittle ring of something ceremonial. Tanaka knew the aircraft by its outline even without the brief. He had seen photographs, had argued with engineers about the feasibility of a bomber that could carry tonnage across the ocean and still sit above AA fire. Now he saw it in 3 dimensions. The B-29's wing looked broad and clean. Its fuselage was longer than any Japanese heavy bomber. 4 big engines hurled it forward, their sound attenuated by height but precise in rhythm. Its belly glinted with what might have been a glazed nose, and impossibly to Tanaka's mind, the plane's gun turrets glowed like small, indifferent fortresses in the sky. He thought of the city that lay beneath that invisible curve of air, factories producing engines and parts for a war already straining against shortages, women and children sheltering in subway stations, the brown waters of Sumida River reflecting fires. He thought of Yokota Airfield and its empty dispersal revetments and of the pilots who, if scrambled, would climb and burn precious fuel trying to reach a plane 10,000 feet above their maximum effective ceiling. He thought with an almost physical certainty of the map rooms and the Emperor's Palace, of the national framework that had been confident, buoyant, by turns arrogant, and felt its sway. On the ground, searchlights began their slow, frantic sweep, heavy cones carving the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries, Type 88 75mm and the larger 127mm pieces were manned, crews whispering commands. Shells traced pale arcs and left brief, ghostly flower bursts against the high cloud deck. The flashes were theatrics against a bomber at that altitude. The sound of the exploding shells never reached the bomber's ears. Lieutenant Nakamura, an AA battery commander, pulled his map closer, hands that had steadied for years trembling slightly. At 27,000 feet, he muttered, a number that confirmed what the binoculars already told him. His voice went thin. "We cannot reach it." Within the Superfortress, hundreds of miles away on Saipan or perhaps even India via the China-Burma-India supply lines, American crewmen eased back into sorties they regarded as routine. The B-29 had been designed for high-altitude daylight precision, terrain ordnance with mechanical dispassion. To Colonel Tanaka, however, the machine was far from routine. It was a declaration in aluminum. The Japanese air defense doctrine had been built around intercepting waves, bringing fighters into contact, and exploiting the altitude limits of older bombers. Those rules no longer fit. As the bomber passed over the glow of Tokyo, Tanaka thought of the communications that would ripple through Imperial headquarters. He imagined the terse, paper-thin dispatches. The flash of foreign script turned into urgent, clipped Japanese. He felt a practical, terrible realization harden in him. This was not a raid that could be repulsed with local heroics. This was not a raid that would be answered by the same measures as the spring and summer raids. The enemy now had a platform that could come and go from above the reach of their craft and most of their guns. If a single bomber could pierce their home skies, so too could a force. On the ridge, Tanaka lowered his binoculars. Metal taste in his mouth, he let the moment stretch until it cracked. In the red-lit tent, a radio operator keyed a microphone and fed the observation up the chain. The words would travel: incoming, high altitude, B-29. Each syllable would be absorbed, catalogued, and then weighed against logistics, fuel, and the thin veneer of hope. Nobody in that broadcast would speak the fear that has no name, the sense that a protective dome had been pierced. The hum faded on the horizon, the contrail dissolving into the stars. Silence, heavier, colder than before, settled over Higata. Tanaka's men lit cigarettes in a sudden collective need for flame. Above them, the night went on as if nothing had happened. But beneath the sky, the concept of sanctuary had been altered forever. Tanaka placed his binoculars back in their leather case and, without looking at anyone, said in a voice that was almost private, "They can fly where our guns cannot reach." Colonel Tanaka's words hung in the air like an echo that refused to die. Around him, his men looked at one another, not in confusion, but with that sharp collective silence soldiers adopt when the truth has just been spoken aloud. Beyond the ridge, the sky was already reclaiming its darkness, the contrail thinning into wisps of vapor, but the sound of that foreign hum still seemed to live inside their skulls. It had not just passed over Tokyo, it had passed over the nation's heart. In the command tent, Lieutenant Commander Mori turned from the map table as a runner entered, breathless and pale. "Sir, radar confirms it. Altitude 29,000 feet. Heading northeast. Estimated speed, over 500 kilometers per hour." Mori blinked at the numbers. It was one thing to read American claims from intelligence reports. It was another to have your instruments confirm them. He drew a slow breath. "Too high," he muttered. "Too fast." The telephone lines to Army Air Defense Command were already glowing with urgency. "Engage interceptors," barked a voice from the other end. Mori hesitated, then replied, "Sir, they cannot reach that height. Our best climb rate ends at 21,000. It's beyond their service ceiling." There was a pause. Then quietly, "Engage anyway." Minutes later, engines coughed and roared from the dark fields of Chofu and Matsudo. Ki-44 Shokis, Tojos, the Americans called them, clawed their way into the night sky. Their pilots, young and hollow-eyed from weeks of night alerts, strained against the G-forces as they climbed, instruments trembling, frost forming along their canopy glass. The altimeters wound higher, 18,000 feet, 19,000, 20,000, until the needles quivered and refused to move further. The air thinned. The engines lost bite. The sky above them, the layer where the B-29 cruised with ease, was an unreachable ocean. Through his binoculars, Tanaka saw their running lights fade into nothing. He did not envy them. He pitied them. He could almost imagine what they were seeing. The faint silhouette of an aircraft far above, so distant it seemed untouchable, like a star that mocked their effort. Inside the B-29, the story was different. Captain Harold Hal Freeman of the 497th Bomb Group sat in the left seat, gloved hands steady on the yoke. Below him, the sprawling lights of Tokyo shimmered faintly through a gauze of haze. The Superfortress hummed like a living organism, each of its 4 Wright R-3350 engines synchronized to a perfect drone. The crew spoke in clipped professional tones: navigator, bombardier, radio operator, gunners. The pressurized cabin kept them warm while outside. The air temperature at altitude was -40. Freeman leaned forward slightly and looked down through the plexiglass. "There it is," he murmured. "Tokyo, first one in." No one cheered. They all knew what this meant. Not just a reconnaissance run, not just another target. This was the psychological threshold. The first flight over the Emperor's city. Below, on the ground, men like Tanaka could only watch. They could not strike back. The radar station at Funabashi tracked the blip as it moved west to east. Too slow to be a fighter. Too high to be a conventional bomber. Reports crackled up the chain to Imperial General Headquarters. By midnight, the staff officers in Tokyo had gathered in their war room, uniforms unbuttoned at the collar, smoke hanging in layers above their heads. A large wall map of the home islands glowed under overhead lamps. A major pointed to the plotted course and said, "There it is, confirmed, B-29. No one spoke for a long time. General Torishiro Kawabe finally broke the silence. "If the Americans can reach Tokyo from their bases," he said, "then we no longer have a defensive perimeter. The war has changed." Outside the windows of the Imperial Palace compound, the city slept in relative calm. But to men like Tanaka and Kawabe, the calm was an illusion, a brief exhalation before the storm. For years, Japan had believed its islands were beyond the reach of heavy bombers. Geography, that ancient ally, had kept them safe. The B-29 erased that advantage overnight. At 0:42, a second radar contact appeared, another superfortress, this one flying slightly lower. It too crossed the coast and vanished out to sea. Tanaka's men watched with an almost religious dread. The Americans weren't attacking tonight. They were measuring, charting routes, testing defenses, and in that realization lay a deeper horror, that the enemy now had the luxury of patience. In the early hours, Tanaka wrote his report by hand. The ink froze slightly on the paper and his handwriting, normally so precise, wandered across the page. Unidentified heavy bomber observed at extreme altitude. Estimated speed surpasses known aircraft capability. Our anti-aircraft fire ineffective. Suggest further intelligence on this new type. He paused, then added one more line, not for the record, but for himself. If they can reach Tokyo, then the war cannot be won. At dawn, as the first light broke over Tokyo Bay, the distant hum of American engines was long gone, but the contrail remained faintly visible, a chalk line drawn across the morning sky. Civilians who rose early to fetch water or sweep their yards looked up and wondered what plane could have flown so high. They did not know it yet, but the era of safety had ended during the night. Colonel Tanaka watched the sunrise through the gray mist. His face was calm, but his mind was already racing through what he knew the next months would bring. More planes, more fire, more death. The fortress in the sky had shown itself once. It would return in hundreds, and when it did, Japan would burn. By late winter 1945, the rhythm of Tokyo's nights had changed. Sirens, once rare and jarring, had become a nightly accompaniment, the city's dark symphony. Blackout curtains hung like funeral drapes in every home. The faintest glow from a cigarette could draw a reprimand from the neighborhood patrols, yet no precaution could stop what was coming. The first B-29 sighting over Tokyo in November had been a warning shot from heaven. Now the sky itself had become a battlefield. Colonel Tanaka stood once more on the Higata Ridge. His observation post expanded, fortified, but no less fragile. The men under him no longer spoke of intercepting the enemy. They spoke of surviving him. Every night the horizon lit with new fires, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. The B-29s came in formations now, not single scouts. They moved in shimmering processions, high and unassailable, their engines a constant thunder that never quite faded. Even when the last bomber had gone, the air still vibrated as if the memory of their flight lingered in the atmosphere. From his post, Tanaka watched as the anti-aircraft guns barked in futility. Each flash of the Type 88s painted the hillside white for an instant, revealing the men's gaunt faces and the sweat that glistened even in winter cold. The shells burst at 20,000 feet, far below the B-29 formations, their explosions blooming like impotent fireworks. "Adjust elevation," shouted Nakamura, his voice hoarse. "Higher!" But they could not. The guns were already straining at their limits. Then came a different kind of terror. At first, Tanaka thought the Americans were dropping high explosives again. The familiar thunderous concussions that shook windows and cracked concrete. But the sound changed, a soft, rolling hiss that spread like rain. Moments later, the horizon lit up in amber waves. The incendiaries, M69 napalm clusters, had arrived. From the upper air, the B-29s opened their bomb bays and released the metal canisters in clusters. They fell not like bombs, but like seeds, tumbling lazily before igniting into brilliant liquid fire. The flames crawled across rooftops, then leapt between houses, feeding on the wooden labyrinth that was Tokyo's architecture. Entire neighborhoods became fields of light. The wind carried embers across the river, where new fires bloomed instantly. The city's geography, once its defense, now betrayed it. Tanaka's Sergeant Sato stood beside him, eyes wide and wet. "Sir, it's burning everywhere." Tanaka didn't answer. He could only watch. From their ridge, they could see the whole basin, a living map of flame. The air itself shimmered with heat. Somewhere far below, thousands of civilians poured into the canals and rivers, their screams carried faintly on the wind. The night had no boundaries, only a red horizon. In the command bunker near Hibiya Park, General Kawabe and his staff struggled to relay orders that no longer mattered. The air defense net was collapsing under the weight of targets. Communications broke down as lines burned or were buried under debris. Fighter squadrons tried to scramble, but their airfields were aflame before they could take off. Those who managed to lift into the air found nothing but smoke and turbulence. At one point, a pilot reported sighting the bombers. Then his transmission dissolved into static. Above the inferno, the B-29s cruised in formation, silhouetted against the glowing city. Captain Hal Freeman's crew wore tinted goggles to shield their eyes from the reflection of fire below. The tail gunner, Sergeant Davis, stared through his blister turret and muttered, "Looks like hell itself." Freeman didn't respond. He knew that was exactly what it was meant to look like. Their orders were to break the enemy's industrial heart, the small machine shops, the cottage industries that fed Japan's war effort. But from this altitude, distinctions vanished. The entire city was one vast target. Freeman looked at the flames and felt a hollowness he could not name. On the ground, Tanaka's men retreated as burning debris began to fall around them. Sparks drifted down like red snow. "Pull back to the shelters," Sato yelled, grabbing a wounded corporal by the arm. The air smelled of oil, wood, and burning flesh, the scent of civilization dissolving. Tanaka stumbled into the dugout and turned one last time toward Tokyo. The skyline was gone. Only pillars of fire remained, reaching upward as if clawing at the bombers themselves. He sank onto a wooden bench, his uniform soaked with sweat despite the freezing air. "It's over," he whispered. "We're watching the end." Sato, sitting beside him, looked at his commander's face and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. By dawn, Tokyo had become a blackened skeleton. The smoke rose in columns that blotted out the sun. Over 100,000 civilians were dead, more than Hiroshima or Nagasaki would later claim. Yet the bombers would return again and again, each time more confident, more numerous, less contested. Colonel Tanaka walked among the ruins that morning, boots crunching over ash. The silence was worse than the noise had been. A mother crouched beside what had once been her home, clutching the charred remains of a child's doll. A dog limped through the wreckage, howling at nothing. The imperial palace stood untouched, a single island of green amid the wasteland, but it was an illusion of endurance. Everything else was gone. Tanaka stopped near a shattered streetcar, its frame twisted like melted wax. He looked up. The contrails were still there, faint ribbons of white across the empty blue. He knew now what they meant, not just power but permanence. The Americans owned the sky, and once you lose the sky, you lose the war. March 10th, 1945. The smell of burned cedar and flesh still lingered in Tokyo's ruins, seeping into everything: uniforms, papers, skin. Colonel Hiroshi Tanaka had not slept more than a few hours in the days since the Great Fire Raid. His eyes were rimmed in red. His once pristine tunic was streaked with soot. From his temporary office in an underground bunker beneath the Army Communications Bureau, he read the latest reports. Airfields destroyed, aircraft lost on the ground, anti-aircraft ammunition nearly depleted. The numbers were clinical, but each one represented a piece of the nation's dying strength. Outside, the capital was unrecognizable. Streets once filled with the rattle of bicycles and the cries of vendors were now black rivers of ash. Smoke still rose from the eastern districts, slow gray threads against a pale sky. The emperor's portrait in Tanaka's office remained clean, untouched by dust, but it only deepened the contradiction. The symbol of an eternal empire standing above a city reduced to cinders. He stared at a wall map of the home islands, its surface marked with dozens of small red pins, each representing a recent bombing target. He traced his finger along the path from the Marianas to Tokyo, then further south toward Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka. The red pins formed a pattern that looked disturbingly like encirclement. The Americans were not merely bombing, they were tightening a noose. A courier entered, bowing deeply. "Colonel, orders from General Kawabe. Air Defense Command requests your presence at headquarters." Tanaka nodded wearily, folded his papers, and stepped into the open air. The wind carried the faint crackle of small fires still burning in the distance. He passed refugees huddled in the shadows of collapsed buildings, their faces blank, their hands outstretched for water that no one had left to give. The headquarters itself had been moved underground after the last raid. Generators throbbed in the narrow corridors, the smell of gasoline heavy in the air. Inside the main chamber, officers crowded around a central table. Maps, reconnaissance photos, and charts were strewn across its surface. General Kawabe looked up as Tanaka entered. The old man's face was pale, lined with exhaustion. "Colonel Tanaka," he said, "you saw the raid firsthand. Tell us what you think." Tanaka hesitated. He glanced at the younger officers, men still speaking in the language of optimism, of countermeasures and recalibration. He had once been one of them. Now, after the night of fire, he no longer believed in words that pretended physics could be reasoned with. He spoke quietly. "Sir, our guns cannot reach them. Our fighters cannot climb to meet them. Even if they could, our fuel is gone. The B-29s have taken the war out of our hands. We are fighting an enemy who attacks from a world above ours." He paused, his gaze steady. "We cannot win." The room went still. The only sound was the buzz of the electric lamp above the table. Kawabe's lips tightened, but he did not rebuke him. One of the younger majors, face flushed with indignation, muttered, "Defeatist talk, Colonel. The spirit of the Yamato race will prevail. We must strike back with what?" Tanaka cut in, his tone sharp enough to slice the air. "Spirit cannot intercept a bomber at 30,000 feet. Courage cannot climb faster than physics allows." The major fell silent. Kawabe looked down at the map, fingers trembling slightly as he traced the enemy's flight paths. Finally, he said, almost to himself, "Then we must find another way, perhaps intercept at takeoff or cripple their bases before they launch." Tanaka exhaled. He did not say what they both knew, that Japan no longer had the range, nor the fuel, nor the strength to reach the Marianas. The empire's borders had shrunk to the home islands. The Americans had conquered the distance. As the meeting adjourned, Tanaka lingered. He approached the map again and stared at the small red dot labeled Saipan. He imagined the vast airfields there, smooth concrete, endless rows of gleaming B-29s waiting in the sun. For the Americans, each mission was logistics and mathematics. For Japan, each raid was catastrophe. Later that night, he climbed to the surface for air. The moon hung low, casting a pale sheen over the skeletal city. A B-29 formation rumbled faintly in the distance, invisible yet unmistakable. Even now they came, relentless, methodical, indifferent. He could almost feel the vibration in his bones. Sato, standing beside him, whispered, "Sir, maybe they will run out of bombs before we run out of cities." Tanaka turned to him slowly. "No, they have more steel, more oil, more sky. We have only land and it burns too easily." The faint glow on the horizon flared again. Another district, another strike. Tanaka watched without flinching. The noise of engines above grew louder, passing directly overhead. For a brief moment he saw the silhouette of one, its massive frame blotting out the stars, and he felt something shift inside him. It was not fear anymore. It was recognition. He understood then that Japan's defeat had not begun with the loss of an island or a battle fleet. It had begun the moment that first B-29 crossed the skies over Tokyo months earlier, silent, unreachable, invincible. That was the moment the war had already turned. Though no one had wanted to admit it, he had seen it that night, and now, standing amid the ruins, he knew it beyond doubt. He looked again toward the horizon. where the flames flickered like dying lanterns, and whispered to himself, "The gods have left the sky to the Americans." April 1945. The rains had come, but even the downpours could not wash away the smell of smoke that clung to Tokyo. What had once been the beating heart of the empire was now a landscape of flattened districts and charred bones. Colonel Hiroshi Tanaka walked the ruins daily, not as an officer but as a witness. Every step through the ash made a soft whispering sound, the sound of a city's memory dissolving beneath his boots. From the hills outside the city, he could see the distant plumes of smoke rising over Yokohama. Another raid, another night of fire. The B-29s came now as casually as summer storms. Their routes were known, their arrival expected. Even the sirens had grown tired. Sometimes they didn't bother to sound at all. People simply looked up at the faint silver trails in the daylight sky and braced themselves. Tanaka's men had stopped recording every raid. The lists of dead had become meaningless columns of numbers. 12,000 here, 8,000 there. Entire neighborhoods were gone. Maps had to be redrawn weekly, not for strategic reasons, but because streets and landmarks had ceased to exist. The colonel had grown thin. He still wore his uniform meticulously, though the seams were fraying. His binoculars, once the symbol of command, now hung at his side like a relic. Some nights he no longer raised them at all. There was no need to observe what could not be stopped. One morning, as he stood on a shattered bridge overlooking the Sumida River, he heard the steady drone again, a sound that had become both familiar and unbearable. He looked up and saw them, a formation of superfortresses gliding through the high clouds, sunlight glinting off their aluminum bellies. He counted 20, then stopped. Counting didn't matter anymore. Beside him, Sergeant Sato adjusted his steel helmet, the strap hanging loose. "Sir," he said softly, "when we were in China, we used to watch our own planes go over like that. We thought they looked like gods." Tanaka nodded, eyes never leaving the sky. "Now we know how the enemy must have felt." At that moment, a series of distant flashes erupted across the horizon, the bombs falling over Kawasaki's industrial district. Seconds later, the sound arrived, a deep rolling tremor that passed through the ground, through their bones. Even from miles away, the shockwave made the bridge shudder. Tanaka gripped the railing. "Steel, oil, everything they need," he murmured. "They're not just destroying factories. They're dismantling our ability to exist." He turned away from the river and walked toward the inner city. What he found there broke something inside him. Streets once lined with shops and schools were now nothing but open fields of debris. Children wandered barefoot, clutching tin bowls. A group of women stood in a line at a relief station, their faces blank, their hair singed short by heat. The war had stripped them not only of their homes, but of the illusion of protection. At the remnants of a Shinto shrine, Tanaka paused. The torii gate was blackened, its top beam sagging. Paper charms fluttered weakly in the breeze. He bowed once, not out of ritual but out of apology. "We promised them safety," he said quietly, "and we delivered them this." That evening, back at the bunker, General Kawabe summoned him. The general's eyes were sunken, his once powerful frame diminished. "Tanaka," he began, voice low, "we are losing the war of the air. Every report says the same. The Americans strike when they wish, where they wish. Even our radar cannot warn us in time." Tanaka stood in silence. Kawabe's gaze drifted to the ceiling, where dust fell from the rumble of distant explosions. "We are told that the army will unleash a secret weapon soon," Kawabe continued. "Jets, rockets, maybe even divine intervention, but—" His voice cracked. "I no longer believe such things." "Sir," Tanaka said quietly, "belief is the only thing left we can't lose." "But it won't stop the bombers." Kawabe smiled bitterly. "Then perhaps the war ends when the sky itself runs out of planes." He looked down at the map, now riddled with burn marks from candles and cigarettes. His finger traced over the southern islands. "Okinawa will fall soon," he said. "And after that, they'll come here. Not just with bombers, with everything." Outside, thunder rumbled, though whether it was weather or distant artillery, no one could tell. Tanaka stepped outside into the night air and tilted his head upward. Through a break in the clouds, the stars appeared, faint and few, barely visible against the city's glow. Among them, a moving point of light glided soundlessly across the heavens. He recognized it immediately. A lone B-29 returning from a mission, heading south toward the Marianas. It looked so peaceful, so effortless, that he felt almost envious. Sato approached quietly. "Sir, the men say it's strange. We used to fear death. Now we just wait for it to come." Tanaka's lips tightened. "That's because death isn't the enemy anymore. Indifference is." He watched the bomber disappear into the clouds. "They don't even see us anymore," he said softly. "To them, we're just coordinates." The rain began again, falling lightly over the blackened city. For a long time, Tanaka stood unmoving, listening to the rhythm of droplets on the ruins. He felt the weight of inevitability pressing down like gravity itself. He understood now what every commander in history dreads, that there comes a point when courage, loyalty, and discipline no longer matter. Only physics, production, and altitude decide the outcome, and Japan had lost all three. August 6, 1945. Dawn broke clear and deceptively calm over Tokyo Bay. The sky was a perfect blue, too perfect, almost unnatural in its stillness. For once there were no air raid sirens, no contrails, no rumble of engines. The air defense posts were quiet, their operators drinking weak tea and watching the horizon with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. Colonel Hiroshi Tanaka sat outside his bunker on an overturned crate, writing in his field notebook. His handwriting was neat again, steadier than it had been in months. He was recording not troop movements or bombing coordinates this time, but his thoughts, the fragments of a man who had spent the last year staring up at the impossible. "The war," he wrote, "is not measured in territory or victory. It is measured in altitude. The higher they flew, the smaller we became. The sun climbed. Heat shimmered over the rubble fields. Then faintly a radio operator burst from the communications room, shouting, 'Report from Hiroshima!' Massive explosion, unknown weapon, entire city gone." The word seemed absurd, like some fevered rumor. "Gone?" Tanaka repeated. "How gone?" "No details, sir, just gone." Silence followed. The few men nearby exchanged glances, their faces a study in disbelief. For months they had lived with the constant roar of hundreds of bombers. Now one plane, one, had apparently done what thousands could not. The enormity of it was incomprehensible. Tanaka rose slowly, looking south, toward the invisible horizon where Hiroshima lay hundreds of miles away. "A single bomber," he murmured. "A single sun." He knew instinctively that the war had just crossed another threshold, one beyond even the reach of his imagination. That night, Tokyo's sky remained empty. No raids, no alerts, only the steady hum of cicadas and the faint crackle of radios repeating fragmented reports. Days later, Nagasaki would follow, and the Empire's silence would deepen into something more final. When the surrender came on August 15th, it was not met with shock among Tanaka's men, only quiet resignation. They had already surrendered in spirit months earlier, when they first realized they could not touch the bombers that ruled the heavens. The Emperor's voice on the radio, calm, distant, almost divine, confirmed what they had already lived. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Tanaka listened to the broadcast in a bare room lit by a single candle. The wax pooled on the floor as the voice faded into static. Around him, soldiers sat motionless, their heads bowed. One man wept openly. Another stared blankly at the flame. Outside, the sky turned gray with the smoke of smoldering ruins. A sky that had once been the Empire's shield, now its tomb. Later, as twilight fell, Tanaka walked alone to the same ridge where he had first seen the B-29 9 months before. The landscape below was unrecognizable, a flattened sea of wreckage where neighborhoods had once stood. He lifted his binoculars out of habit, though there was nothing left to see. The air was still. Even the distant hum of American bombers was gone. He remembered that first night, November 24th, 1944, when the silver shape had glided silently across the stars. He had known then, deep in his bones, what his superiors would only come to understand much later, that the war was lost the moment the B-29 appeared over Tokyo. It was not a single aircraft, but a symbol of inevitability, of a nation that could reach across oceans while his own could barely defend its skies. As the wind picked up, he closed his notebook and tucked it into his coat. "It began up there," he whispered, looking toward the heavens, "and so it ends." A distant drone reached his ears. One last patrol of American planes heading north toward their new occupation bases. The sound was low and steady, almost peaceful. Tanaka did not flinch. He watched them pass until they faded into the sunset, their silver wings catching the last light of a dying empire. He turned back toward the city, now quiet for the first time in years. The war was over, but its echo would live on in the silence above. The sky that had once been untouchable was now a memorial, to ambition, to failure, to all the men who had believed the heavens could protect them. Colonel Hiroshi Tanaka removed his cap, closed his eyes and listened to the fading hum until it became nothing at all. The sky over Tokyo was empty once more.